Hello everybody, if it's your first time with us, welcome, and if it's your time coming back, welcome back. Today we're going to continue our series on beginner strategy, and what we're looking at today is making a plan. When we start that transition, right, out of the opening and into the middle game, how can we come up with a plan? What should we be doing? This is a question that I find a lot of beginners have a real difficult time figuring out the next phase. We've learned some opening principles. We know what we should be doing early on. Maybe we've even studied the end game or tactics, been doing puzzles. But how do we make sure that we keep improving our position all the way through the middle so that we can win in the end? Well, that's what we're going to look at here today. We're going to look at two main positions and talk about some ideas and the process for how we can come up with making a plan. The first position we're going to look at, we're going to have the white pieces here. It's a more open type of position. This position has come out of a Sicilian Najdorf, and you see that there is a lot going on in the center of the board. So, anytime we start transitioning to the middle game, I want us to ask three main questions, right? There's three main things we're going to need to think about when we're coming up with our plan. The first thing we want to think about is, where do we want to play? Should we focus our play on the king side, on the queen side, or in the center of the board? So the first thing we need to do is plan where we're going to primarily be moving our pieces to. The second thing is, how can we improve our pieces? If we look at this position for white, we notice that we've got several pieces toward the center. We've got our queen on f3, knight on d4, knight on c3. These are looking pretty decent right now. But we've also got a bishop on e2, which is not doing very much. We've got a rook on h1, which is not doing very much. So part of our plan needs to involve finding ways to get our bad pieces, our pieces that aren't helping a lot, into the action. And then the third question we're going to ask ourselves is, what is our opponent's plan? What's black's idea here? And how can we limit our opponent's counter chances? How can we make sure they're not going to strike against us? So those are the three things that we need to be thinking about. Where should we play? How can we improve our pieces? And how can we limit our opponent's pieces? So how do we do that? Okay, well, first, choosing where to play. There's a very good rule of thumb when it comes for choosing where to play, and the first thing we should ask ourselves is, what's going on in the center? In this position, the center of the board is pretty chaotic still. Black could play d5, he could play e5. White could play e5, white could play f5. There's a lot of potential here. Nothing is resolved. The board hasn't locked up, there haven't been exchanges, and there's a big fight going on for it. So when the battle is still raging for the center, that's where you want to focus your initial efforts. A good rule of thumb is you should not start an attack on the king side or the queen side on the flanks until the center is resolved. Well, why is that? The reason is, if we start focusing on the edges, on the king side or the queen side, then our opponent is probably going to get the upper hand in the center if they choose to play there. If our opponent takes over the center, their pieces are going to have more flexibility. Remember, pieces in the center can go to more squares, and they can influence potentially the entire board. So we want to be the ones who win the center if we can help it, or if the center closes off, then we'll start worrying about one flank or another. So in this position, it's already a good idea. We know we need to keep fighting for the center. We need to figure out a way to resolve it before we start going about ideas on the king side or the queen side. Now, what ideas do we have in the center? How can we make that happen? Well, we want to consider our pawn breaks. The two main pawn breaks we have in the position with white here are f5 and e5. So those are our two main things that we can consider, and we want to try to figure out which one of these is better, which is going to give us a little bit of an edge, which one is going to help with improving our pieces and playing against our opponent's plan. So let's consider both of those. Well, if we play the move f5 here, it does look like potentially we could start opening up some lines. One of the ways to improve our pieces is to open lines. If this f-pawn came off the board, then we'd have a nice f-file for our rook. And our queen would also be on that f-file. We could get a big attack going over there. However, the drawback with f5 is that black doesn't have to take here. He doesn't even have to let you take. He could push forward. He could play the move e5 and close the center. And after our knight moves, well, there's not a lot of good places for this knight to go. It can't come to f5, a pawn's there. It can't come to f3. It can't come to e2. The only square for the knight is going to be to play knight to b3. And that's not a terrible place for the knight, but it does give black the option of playing knight takes b3. After we recapture with either the c or the a pawn, our kingside pawns are going to be a little bit weaker. If we look, we know that maybe black is going to try to play on this queen side. He already has a queen on the c file. He could potentially try to move his pawns, b5, a5. So we don't really want to create targets over there. So I don't really like the f5 break here. And an added drawback is with this pawn on a light square, we mentioned our bishop on e2 is bad before, right? Well, if this pawn stays on a light square, our bishop is going to become even worse. So let's take a look at the other break. Let's look at the move e5. e5 moves to a dark square, so this does open up some space. Potentially, we can now bring the bishop to f3, give it life on the b1 to h7 diagonal. It also attacks this knight, so black has to do something about the immediate threat. If he wanted to just push past and close the center, he can't really do that like he could if we played f5, because, well, his knight's under attack. We're going to take it. So black has to choose whether to move that knight or whether to take in the center. Our pieces are gaining some more space. We're going to be able to improve them. We're opening up some lines. Our queen has more space on the diagonal. If the pawns trade, we'll make more space from our rooks, and as we mentioned, we're opening lines for our bishop. So, what does this move do? It fights for the center. It shows a direction where to play. We're beginning to open lines. We're starting to think about improving our pieces. And lastly, it limits black's plans too. What's another idea black might have had? Well, he wants to play on the queen side with moves like b5 and b4, starting to rush toward the white king. With this move e5, black can't play b5 yet, because the white queen suddenly eyes the diagonal and will be able to take this rook on a8. So, let's see what black does. He goes ahead, chooses to capture the pawn. We decide to trade off, opening more lines, giving our pieces potential to improve, and now the knight comes back to h7. Now here we have a little bit of a tactical moment. The two bishops are facing off, and we have to decide, are we going to trade these bishops, or are we going to move the bishop in order to keep it on the board? Well, our pawn on e5 here is also under attack from the black queen. So, what we have to do is decide, are we going to be willing to sacrifice that? Is that something we're going to give up? Or if we trade, can we keep that tempo? So let's go ahead and trade the bishops here. This gives us back the move, and now that black has taken with the queen, the e5 pawn is no longer under attack. That's safe. Had he taken with the king would be in the center. That would be good for our attack. And we can continue with our plan. So, improving our pieces, right? The center is now resolved. There's not a whole lot of fight for the center. So we can start thinking about potentially playing on the king or the queen side. What pawn breaks exist now? Maybe there's going to be moves like h5 and g4. Those can factor into our plans. But let's go ahead and think about improving those pieces and limiting our opponent's play. In this position, white played h4. Now, what's the idea behind this move? Well, this knight retreated to the h7 square. So remembering, we're limiting our opponent's pieces. Where can this knight go from h7? Well, he could go f8, f6, or g5. So this h4 move prevents the knight from being able to develop to g5 and attack the queen. It also prevents the queen from potentially coming to g5 and giving this check. So this is a prophylactic move. We're moving against our opponent's idea. And now, suddenly, black's ideas become a lot harder to find. Earlier, it looked like maybe he was going to get a quick attack going with b5 and b4. He can't do that. Our queen is limiting his play. Our pawn is limiting his play over here. So black is going to have to start coming up with other ideas. Bishop d7, trying to get the bishop into the game. And what do we have in our position? How can we keep improving? What's bad here? We mentioned that bishop on e2. Here we play the move bishop d3. Now, this may look odd. It is offering up a trade, but think about the good pieces in this position for both sides and the bad pieces. Black's knight on c5 is one of his most active pieces in the position. It's attacking a lot of squares in the white camp, it's doing a lot of good, and white's bishop on e2 is doing practically nothing. So if we trade these two pieces, for one, it's going to move our rook up to d3 if we take with that, so our rook comes a little more into the game, and for two, we've basically traded off a piece that wasn't doing altogether very much at all, for a piece that was doing a lot. So black took in this situation, which is maybe a slight mistake, and after rook d3, now we have a very nice position. There's a few more pieces off the board, but we're still limiting black's play. He can't come to a lot of squares. Suddenly, maybe we're going to double rooks on the d file. Maybe we'll put the rook on f1, attack on the f file. Our knights are covering all the squares of black's bishop. We still have this pin on the diagonal, and we're limiting our opponent's play. So that's the key to making these plans. What all happened in there? Let's go back a few moves. We start with choosing where to play, moving into the center, making that break with e5. We start thinking of ways to improve our pieces. We're opening lines, and we're limiting our opponent's play. Now, one thing you might ask here is what happens if black chooses to play queen takes e5, because that is also a very real option here in the position, and it leads to some different games. This is probably a little bit better for black, but remember, as white, our goal here is to open up lines, so it's not really so bad to sacrifice this pawn here. It then gives our rook some very nice files to attack on. It's a way of improving our pieces. So in this position, we actually did offer a pawn sacrifice. Black chose not to accept it, and then we punished him and made things even worse. So open those lines, get your pieces into play, work against your opponent, limit his counter chances. Let's go ahead and look at how we can use these same ideas in our next position, which is more of a closed board. So this position comes to us out of a French defense. And unlike the last position, you'll see the center is very locked up. White has these pawns on c3, d4, and e5, and black has these pawns on e6, d5, and c4, and there's not a whole lot that can happen in the center right now. So how do we choose where to play? Remember, our first thing is let's choose where to play. We need to come up with some ideas. If the center's not resolved, that's where we want to go, but here we have a locked, closed center. How are we going to choose what to do? A nice way to figure out which side of the board we want to play on is to look at the pawn chain. You'll notice that our pawns here are all connected, all protecting each other, and they almost make a line like they're pointing toward the queen side. If we look at our pawn chains, a lot of times that can give us an idea of which direction we want to play. Well, why is that? Well, these pawns are pointed toward the queen side, and that means that black is going to have more space over here. You notice all these squares that black can bring his pieces to. He has a spatial advantage on the queen side. White's pieces point toward the king side. He has all of these squares on this side that are much easier for his pieces to come to than black. So in general, black is going to try to play toward the queen side in this sort of game, and white is going to try to play toward the king side. This is what space has to do with our middle game ideas. We want to play where we have more space and try to press that advantage. Now, we're going to choose queen side here to work with, so what are our other aims, right? Well, we want to improve our pieces, and we want to limit our opponent's play. In a closed board, we have more time to deal with things. We saw in the last game things moved very quickly. In open boards, suddenly there were tactics, there were plans, there were things happening very fast. On this closed board, it's going to be more slow. So what sort of things should we be looking for in order to improve our pieces? Well, one thing is to look for what we call outposts. An outpost is a square where your opponent's pawns have already advanced past it, or the ones on the side have been taken away from it, so if you put a piece on that square on the outpost, a pawn can never attack it. So where is there an outpost in the position right now? Well, that would be the b3 square. White already has played the moves a3 and c3, which means this b3 square becomes a vulnerability. If black can put pieces on that square and defend them, white can never move his pawns backwards. He can never use a pawn in order to kick our pieces off of that square. So a good idea here for black is to play moves like knight a5 in order to prepare for b3. So let's say black plays knight a5. And of course white wants to limit this idea. White doesn't want to allow black to simply play his knight here, attack his rook and his bishop, so white plays knight bd2. And now we start thinking about our next plans. How could we fight for the outpost? There's a lot of different ideas here. We mentioned playing on the queen side. Black has some different thoughts. One is he can play the move bishop to c6. This is an idea that's common in the French, to play bishop c6, queen d7, and then bishop a4 in order to fight for this square. So that's one idea black has, playing on the queen side, looking to improve our pieces. We notice that this d7 bishop is very bad because of the pawns which block it in. So this is a great way to try to get that bishop into the game. If we can move it to a4, maybe even eventually c2, and then bring it to this side of the board where it will be very good. Black also needs to get this knight into the game. It's blocking his bishop back here. We know that we want to play on the queen side, so how could we get this knight on e7 in order to help on the queen side? Well, another kind of sneaky maneuver, which seems like it's moving backwards, may be undeveloping, but black could even play knight to c8. c8, b6, maybe that knight will even come to a5 at some point. So even though these are slow-moving ideas, remember we're on a closed board now. We have more time. White can't really get anything going very quickly. Now, white's ideas might involve around moving this knight. He probably wants to eventually play things like f4, f5. Maybe he's even going to bring his other pawns forward, g4, h4, and start pressing his spatial advantage on that side. And as a result of that, as black, maybe we're not even going to castle over here. Thinking about that, thinking about limiting our opponent's play, maybe we're going to move this knight over to this side. Maybe we're going to put a queen on c7, our bishop to e7, and we might even castle to the queen side, castle long instead. These are the sort of plans we want to come up with. Thinking about, where is my opponent going to play? How can I stay out of danger? How can I limit their ideas and improve my pieces? So, bishop c6 is a way of improving that. White could play g3 here, trying to prepare ideas like h4, things like maybe moving a knight back over to g2, getting ready to play on the king side. And queen d7 would continue with our plan. Let's say knight h4, white's going through, he's trying to play on this side. Bishop to a4, queen to e1 gets out of the way. And if we get in bishop c2, look, we've got our bishop to this beautiful side, and our plans are coming to fruition. Great. Granted, white has other moves in there. There's other ways that this can come about. But this is how we think about our plans. This is how we think about our ideas. Where are we going to play? Working on the queen side. Where are we going to potentially have pawn breaks? What should we look out for? Well, maybe white's going to eventually play moves like f4, f5. And now we're fighting for this square. Our knight's fighting for f5. Our bishop's fighting for f5. We can even play g6. So we're thinking about potential breaks. Improving our pieces. Our knights may look a little awkward. Our pieces may look a little awkward. But on that closed board, we have time. You can take your time, maneuver pieces. Maybe this one will come to this side. Our bishop can then come out. Our bishop here has come all the way d7 to a4 to c2, and now it's a beautiful looking piece. So remember, on a closed board, think about ways you can maneuver your pieces to get to the best squares. Look for outposts, fight for those as well, and still take those opponents' plans into consideration. Make sure you're always thinking about that and working all of it together. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them in the section below. Hopefully this will help to give you some idea of things to look for. Obviously, every position is different. Every position will require its own line of thought. But the big three things: choose where we're going to play, improve our pieces, and limit our opponent's play. So play prophylactically, find outposts, create space, and make sure that we're doing everything we can to improve our game. Let me know if you have any questions. Wishing you the best of luck and hoping that all of your plans will come to fruition in your games to come.